We often think of politics as a matter of policies, ideologies, or institutional power. But beneath the surface, something deeper is at work, something older, more instinctive, and far more persuasive: the power of storytelling. Every political system, every election, every protest is also a contest of narratives. Who are we? Who threatens us? What future should we imagine? And what past must we remember or forget? Political storytelling isn't just about slogans or speeches. It's about shaping the very reality we live in. It frames what we believe, what we fear, what we hope for, and ultimately what we vote for. The stories we tell about nations, enemies, progress, or decline become the emotional scaffolding of political life. They translate complexity into meaning, they forge identities, they justify power. But stories also deceive. They conceal as much as they reveal. And in the wrong hands, storytelling can become a weapon of manipulation, division, or control. A military operation framed as a responsibility to protect invokes images of humanitarian aid, moral obligation, and civilian rescue. The same act, reframed as imperialist intervention, conjures legacies of domination, resource extraction, and foreign occupation. When political actors speak of cultural preservation, they may evoke endangered traditions, language, or community memory. But the same narrative can be twisted into rhetoric that excludes, scapegoats, or suppresses diversity, repackaged as a defense against outsiders. Calls for climate justice center on fairness, ecological survival, and reparations for those hit hardest by environmental harm. Yet opponents may reframe the same policies as authoritarian overreach, warning of bureaucratic control, loss of freedom, and a looming green tyranny. These are not just differences in messaging, they're differences in worldview, competing stories that shape how we interpret reality, assign blame, and imagine the future. To understand politics today, we must look beyond facts and laws into the narratives that animate them. This is the story behind all stories, how political storytelling shapes the world we live in. Political narratives are not the same as simple stories or spin. At their core, narratives are the deep structures we use to make sense of the world. Frameworks that link events into a coherent sequence, connect characters to roles, and assign meaning to who we are and where we come from. Storytelling, by contrast, is the strategic craft of deploying those narratives, choosing which scenes to show, which heroes to highlight, and which villains to vilify. Every political narrative relies on 5 essential elements. First, characters, the heroes who embody our hopes and the villains who symbolize our fears. Second, conflict, the struggle that drives the story forward, pitting us against them. Third, plot, the arc of challenge, crisis, and resolution that gives narrative momentum. Fourth, setting, the social, cultural, or historical backdrop that shapes meaning. And finally, moral, the underlying lesson or value that the story seeks to imprint on its audience. To understand why narratives matter more than dry argument or data, we turn to communication scholar Walter Fisher and his narrative paradigm. Fisher argues that humans are not primarily Homo economicus, rational calculators endlessly weighing costs, and instead we are Homo narrans, storytelling animals who perceive the world through the lens of coherent, credible tales. When we evaluate a political message, we judge it not only on logical grounds, but on whether it rings true in our lived experience and whether it resonates with the values we share. In this paradigm, coherence, the internal consistency of a story, and fidelity, its correspondence with our sense of reality, become the ultimate tests of persuasive power. A statistic can be disputed, but a well-told narrative that aligns with our hopes and fears will stick in our minds and guide our judgments. In politics, this means that the storyteller who offers the most believable, emotionally compelling narrative often wins the day, not through debate, but through the power of the story itself. Political persuasion rarely begins with a statistic. It begins with a story, a grieving mother, a rising hero, a threat on the horizon. These aren't just emotional hooks, they're narrative devices that shape how we see the world and what we believe should be done. Political narratives work because they don't just present information, they give it meaning. At the center of this power is emotional resonance. A budget plan framed as a battle for working families will land very differently than one described in technical terms. Stories translate complexity into clarity, and often into urgency. They frame problems not as abstractions, but as lived experiences, something we can feel, fear, or fight for. This power is explained by what psychologists call narrative transportation, the immersive experience of entering a story's world. When we're transported, we lower our defenses, suspend disbelief, and open ourselves to persuasion. We don't scrutinize each fact, we follow the plot. This makes stories a particularly potent tool for shaping political attitudes, even in the absence of rigorous evidence. And it doesn't stop there. Narratives activate cognitive heuristics, mental shortcuts that help us make decisions quickly. Rather than weighing all the facts, we rely on familiar story structures. Who's the hero? Who's the villain? Is there a clear moral? These structures trigger what Daniel Kahneman called System 1 thinking, fast, intuitive, emotionally charged. While System 2 is more logical and deliberate, it's also slower, and most political communication never gets that far. If a narrative aligns with our values or identity, we're likely to accept it without much resistance. Neuroscience confirms this. Drew Weston has shown that political narratives activate parts of the brain involved in emotion and memory, far more than those used for analytical reasoning. In his words, the political brain is an emotional brain. Meanwhile, classic research by Carl Hovland demonstrated how source credibility, our trust in the messenger, can override the message itself. A trusted figure delivering a compelling narrative can shift beliefs more powerfully than a mountain of counter-evidence. All of this means that political storytelling isn't a soft skill. It's a central mechanism of power. It shapes how we interpret policies, who we blame in crises, and what futures we can imagine. In the contest for public opinion, it's not always the most factual argument that wins. It's the story that feels truest to those who hear it. Every political story is built, not just told. Behind the rhetoric and slogans lies a carefully crafted structure designed to evoke emotion, assign meaning, and mobilize action. At its core, political storytelling uses a familiar architecture: characters, conflict, and consequence. The characters are often archetypes: a hero, the reformer, the outsider, the voice of the people; a villain, the corrupt elite, the foreign enemy, the failing system; and sometimes a victim, symbolizing who is suffering and who needs saving. These aren't just dramatic devices, they anchor moral clarity in complex realities. The conflict is what gives the story momentum. It's rarely neutral. It's the people versus the elite, the nation versus chaos, the truth-tellers versus the liars. These binaries reduce ambiguity, sharpen emotional stakes, and invite audiences to pick a side. In an age of polarization, this frame becomes a political weapon. Language plays a key role in this construction. Metaphors condense whole ideologies into punchy, visceral slogans. War on terror evokes sacrifice and unity. Drain the swamp conjures images of decay and cleansing. Such phrases don't just describe, they prescribe action. Similarly, symbolism, from flags and colors to hand gestures and historical references, turns abstract ideals into emotionally loaded icons. Frameworks like story-based strategy and frames help decode how this works. Story-based strategy emphasizes identifying dominant narratives and disrupting them with counter-stories that resonate with lived experiences. The frames model, facts, relevance, affect, metaphor, example, structure, offers a toolkit for building persuasive, value-laden stories that stick. Ultimately, constructing a political story means more than telling a tale. It means shaping reality itself. Through selective emphasis, emotional rhythm, and symbolic charge, storytellers define who we are, what's wrong, and what must be done. Traditional media once held a monopoly on narrative curation, deciding which stories reached the public and how they were told. Editors and producers selected events, framed debates, and chose images that lent emotional weight to the chosen narrative. As competition increased, even legacy outlets shifted toward dramatization, repeating key phrases, replaying moments in endless loops, and using sensational graphics to capture attention. This gradual turn toward spectacle laid the groundwork for today's accelerated storytelling environment. With the democratization of digital channels, algorithms replaced human gatekeepers. These opaque formulas prioritize content that generates rapid engagement, emotion, shock, outrage, or delight. A single post can ignite global discussion within minutes, its reach determined not by journalistic judgment, but by code that rewards high reaction and resharing rates. Context and nuance evaporate in this process as algorithms favor brevity and sensationalism over balanced explanation. The result is 1,000 micronarratives, each amplified within its own bubble and defended fiercely by its inhabitants. Advances in artificial intelligence have radically expanded the scale, speed, and subtlety of political storytelling. No longer confined to generating convincing text, images, or deepfake videos, AI now operates as a full-spectrum narrative engine, analyzing audience sentiment, adapting messages in real time, and optimizing emotional impact with surgical precision. Combined with behavioral data and psychographic profiling, these systems can tailor not just what story is told, but how it's told to each individual. Algorithms, powered increasingly by machine learning and, on the horizon, quantum-enhanced computation, are no longer just amplifiers. They are co-authors and curators of the political imagination. As computing power leaps forward, even quantum processors promise to decode and predict narrative dynamics across entire populations, unleashing capabilities for influence that were once unimaginable. These tools enable the launch of massive narrative salvos, coordinated bursts of posts, memes, videos, and replies, calibrated to shape emotions, distort perceptions, and preempt dissent. In this emerging environment, it's not just that falsehoods go viral, it's that corrections are outpaced before they can even begin. We are entering an age where narrative warfare is no longer metaphor, but infrastructure, powered by technologies that may shape not just opinion, but the very contours of reality itself. Powerful entities, states, corporations, and well-funded interest groups recognize the value of narrative control and invest heavily in acquiring or influencing these digital channels. They speak of liberation and democratization, yet often channel resources into building private narrative infrastructures, complex networks of content farms, bot armies, and influencer partnerships. By shaping trending topics, they steer public attention toward desired storylines, quietly sidelining inconvenient facts or dissenting viewpoints. This narrative capture ensures that the stories most heard are those safest for entrenched power. The rise of viral storytelling and AI-driven amplification has given birth to narrative warfare, a contest in which success is measured by the ability to dominate public perception rather than the ballot box alone. In this environment, understanding how stories propagate, mutate, and endure is not an academic exercise. It is a survival skill for any democracy or movement. By decoding the mechanics of algorithmic bias, AI creation, and strategic amplification, we reclaim the possibility of honest discourse and resist the forces that seek to bend truth into a weapon. Not all storytelling is harmless. The same narrative tools that rally a community or spark reform can be turned to deceive, exclude, or control. At what point does storytelling cease to illuminate and start to manipulate? The line between persuasion and propaganda is not always bright. Propaganda doesn't simply fabricate lies. It tells stories that feel true, bypassing scrutiny by seducing emotion. It simplifies, moralizes, and isolates complexity in favor of clarity. And clarity, when too neat, becomes dangerous. That's why narrative pluralism, the coexistence of competing and even contradictory stories, is not just a cultural luxury, it's a democratic necessity. In a healthy society, no single narrative is allowed to totalize reality, diverse voices, especially those from the margins, challenge the dominant scripts. They break the illusion that any one version of the world is final, and they reintroduce moral imagination into political life. Justice begins when new stories are told. At the global level, the stakes are even higher. Nations don't merely project power, they project meaning. Through strategic narratives, they frame themselves as guardians of peace, victims of injustice, or heirs to a historic mission. These stories justify interventions, forge alliances, and define enemies. In this way, international relations become a battle of world building, whose story becomes the story that defines legitimacy, sovereignty, and progress. But here lies the paradox. Every story is a frame, and every frame includes and excludes. Narratives liberate when they give voice to the voiceless, when they reveal what power hides, but they dominate when they narrow vision, erase nuance, or demand total loyalty. The same structure that can spark a revolution can also enforce an orthodoxy. That is the double edge of political storytelling. And so we arrive at the final question, not just for analysts or citizens, but for all of us living in this world of competing fictions. Which stories have shaped your view of reality? Who benefits from them? What parts of the world do they make visible? And what parts do they erase? In the age of narrative warfare, truth is not just what we argue about, it's what we're told to imagine. And the power to imagine differently may be the most radical act of all.